What if I told you there's a story in the Bible so shocking, so raw, it feels almost out of place? This biblical story is not your typical tale of faith and redemption. It's a narrative of betrayal, darkness, and devastating consequences. A mirror reflecting what happens when humanity strays far from God. But here's the twist. Even in its horror, it holds profound lessons that can change how you see yourself, your faith, and the world around you. Ready to uncover a truth that will leave you speechless? Imagine sitting down with a story so raw, so unsettling, that it makes you question not just human nature, but the very state of your soul. This biblical story from Judges 19:21 does exactly that. It's not the kind of narrative you hear in polished sermons. It's messy, dark, and heartbreakingly real. Yet, isn't it often in the mess that God's greatest truths shine through? The Bible doesn't just comfort, it confronts like a mirror that shows the good, the bad, and the parts we'd rather not see. We live in a time where phrases like, "follow your heart" and "live your truth" are plastered everywhere. But what happens when everyone decides their truth is the only truth? This biblical story paints a chilling picture of what unfolds when there's no moral compass. Think about it. Would you feel safe in a world where people lived without rules? That's the world described here, and honestly, it feels closer to home than we'd like to admit. The Bible is holding up a warning sign, saying, "Don't go down this road." Reading this story feels like watching a thriller unfold. Every twist makes you gasp, but you can't look away. It's not just about the characters, it's about the ripple effect of choices. Let's be honest, how many times have we underestimated the consequences of small sins? It starts with a whisper of compromise, but before you know it, you're miles away from where you should be. This biblical story is a masterclass in how tiny cracks in morality can lead to catastrophic collapse. And here's the question that always comes up. Why would God allow such a gruesome story to be in the Bible? Shouldn't the Bible be uplifting and comforting? Well, yes, but think about life. The most powerful lessons often come from the darkest moments. This biblical story is raw because life is raw. It's God's way of saying, even when you're at your worst, I'm still here. It's not just history. It's a call to wake up and recognize the danger of walking away from His path. Picture this. You're reading the Bible at night, and you come across this story. The tension is so thick, you can almost hear the cries, feel the dread, and sense the urgency in the air. This biblical story grips your heart because it's more than a story. It's a reflection of our own capacity for both good and evil. It's like that one friend who tells you the hard truth when no one else will. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat, and honestly, isn't that what makes it trustworthy? History is full of tragedies that started with unchecked sin, wars, injustice, even personal failures. This biblical story is a stark reminder that sin, no matter how small, is never harmless. It grows, infecting everything around it. Have you ever noticed how one bad decision can snowball? It's like spilling coffee on your shirt before work, and by the end of the day, everything feels ruined. But unlike coffee stains, sin has eternal consequences. And here, the Bible is screaming, "Stop! Turn around before it's too late." What makes this story even more powerful is how deeply it connects with today's world. It's easy to dismiss ancient events as irrelevant, but look around, are we so different? A society without accountability, a culture that justifies anything in the name of freedom. Sound familiar? This biblical story forces us to examine our own hearts, to ask where we've let compromise seep in. The Bible isn't just old wisdom, it's a daily challenge to live differently. This narrative doesn't just shake you, it lingers. It's like that one movie scene you can't get out of your head because it felt too real. And just when you think it can't get darker, you start to sense a deeper purpose behind the chaos. This biblical story doesn't leave you in despair. It quietly prepares you for redemption. But first, let's take a closer look at the central figures in this tragic drama, the Levite and his concubine. Their choices set the stage for everything to come. The story begins with a Levite from the hills of Ephraim, a man whose life, on the surface, might seem ordinary, yet his decisions lead to extraordinary consequences. This biblical story draws us in as he sets out to reconcile with his concubine, who had fled to her father's house in Bethlehem. Imagine the tension, months of separation, unresolved conflict, and the determination to bring her back. Doesn't this sound like the struggles we often face in relationships, where pride and misunderstanding create chasms? The Bible doesn't shy away from such raw human experiences. Picture the Levite standing at the threshold of her father's house, maybe rehearsing what he would say. Relationships are messy, and this biblical story doesn't paint a fairy tale picture. It's relatable. How many of us have faced moments of regret where we wish we could undo the past? The Levite's journey to Bethlehem is more than a physical trip. It's a reflection of the lengths we go to restore what's broken. But here's the catch. Even the best intentions can unravel without God's guidance. Her father welcomes the Levite warmly, almost excessively so. Days stretch into nearly a week as he convinces the Levite to stay, offering food and drink. It's a scene that feels oddly familiar, like that one friend who insists just one more coffee, and before you know it, hours have passed. But beneath this hospitality lies a subtle warning. Delays, even well-intentioned ones, can lead to missed opportunities or worse. This biblical story reminds us that lingering too long in comfort can blind us to impending danger. When the Levite and his concubine finally set out, the story takes a darker turn. They begin their journey late in the day, a detail that seems small but becomes crucial. It's as if the Bible is whispering, pay attention to the details. They matter. How often do we delay decisions, thinking there's still time, only to find ourselves unprepared when challenges arise? This biblical story nudges us to be intentional with our choices, knowing that timing can mean the difference between safety and disaster. As night falls, the couple faces another challenge, finding shelter. They pass by Jebus, later known as Jerusalem, because it wasn't an Israelite city, opting instead for Gibeon in the territory of Benjamin. It's a decision driven by trust, or rather, a misplaced sense of security. Isn't it fascinating how we often seek safety in the familiar, even when the familiar isn't always safe? This biblical story teaches us to discern wisely, not assuming that what feels right is always what is right. The Levite and his concubine arrive in Gibeon, expecting the hospitality that was customary in Israelite culture. But the silence of the town is deafening. No one offers them shelter. It's a moment that stings with rejection. Have you ever been in a situation where you expected kindness but were met with indifference? This biblical story doesn't just recount an ancient event. It resonates deeply with the human experience of feeling alone in moments of vulnerability. Finally, an elderly man invites them into his home, providing the warmth and protection they desperately need, or so it seems. This biblical story takes a haunting turn, but for now, let's pause to reflect on this act of kindness. It's a reminder that even in the darkest places, God can use ordinary people to shine a light. Have you ever considered how your simple acts of kindness could change someone's story? Sometimes just opening your door or your heart can make all the difference. This portion of the narrative is layered with complexities. The Levite's pursuit of reconciliation, the choices made along the way, and the tension of what's about to unfold. It's a powerful reminder that life's journey isn't just about reaching the destination, but about the decisions we make at every step. This biblical story keeps us on edge, hinting at the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. But as the Levite and his concubine settle into the elderly man's home for the night, the stage is set for an act so dark it will reverberate through all of Israel. What happens next is a chilling reminder of what happens when evil goes unchecked. Stay with me as we uncover the tragic events that will shake an entire nation. Imagine arriving in a town as the sun sets, tired from a long journey and hoping for a warm welcome, only to be met with closed doors and cold stares. This biblical story takes a striking turn here, revealing a side of human nature that feels all too familiar. The Levite and his concubine, vulnerable and in need, are ignored by the people of Gibeon. Hospitality, a cornerstone of Israelite culture, is conspicuously absent. Doesn't it make you wonder how often we, too, overlook those in need, thinking someone else will help? In ancient Israel, offering hospitality wasn't just a nice gesture. It was a moral obligation. Travelers relied on the kindness of strangers for safety and shelter. Yet in Gibeon, the streets grow darker and the silence grows louder. This biblical story paints a vivid picture of a community that had lost its way, where self-interest trumped compassion. Think about it. How many times have we passed by someone in need because we were too busy? The Bible here isn't just telling a story, it's holding up a mirror. Finally, an elderly man, a stranger himself in Gibeon, steps forward and invites the Levite and his concubine into his home. His act of kindness shines like a single candle in a pitch-black room. This biblical story reminds us that even in the most corrupt environments, individuals can still choose righteousness. How often do we underestimate the power of one good deed? Imagine if we all chose to be that one candle, lighting the way for others. But let's not overlook the weight of what's happening here. The elderly man's hospitality is more than generosity. It's an act of courage. In a town where no one else stepped up, he risked his own safety to shelter strangers. This biblical story challenges us to ask, when was the last time we stepped out of our comfort zone to help someone in need? Maybe it's offering a meal, a ride, or simply a listening ear. Small acts can have eternal impact. What makes this moment even more powerful is its contrast. The indifference of Gibeon's residents underscores just how extraordinary the elderly man's actions are. It's easy to go with the flow, to conform to the apathy around us. This biblical story shows us that true character is revealed not in comfort, but in crisis. Are we willing to stand out, to be the one who says, "I will help," even when no one else does? Yet, as the Levite and his concubine settle into the elderly man's home, a sense of unease lingers. This biblical story doesn't let us rest, because life rarely offers easy answers. The kindness shown here is a brief respite, but it's overshadowed by the darkness closing in. It's a sobering reminder that while individual acts of goodness matter, they cannot erase the collective consequences of a community's sin. Think about the neighborhoods we live in, the churches we attend, the workplaces we inhabit. Are they places of warmth and welcome, or have we, like Gibeon, become indifferent to the needs around us? This biblical story forces us to examine not just our personal actions, but the culture we contribute to. It's not enough to be kind. We must also challenge the systems and attitudes that allow indifference to thrive. The Bible doesn't include this scene to make us feel hopeless. It's here to wake us up. Hospitality isn't just about opening our homes. It's about opening our hearts. This biblical story nudges us to see the people we might otherwise ignore. The colleague struggling in silence, the neighbor who always seems distant, the stranger at the grocery store who looks like they've had a hard day. It's an invitation to be intentional in showing love. As night falls in Gibeon, the stage is set for an act of unimaginable evil. The elderly man's courageous kindness, though profound, cannot shield them from what's coming. This biblical story leaves us questioning, how could a community fall so far, and what will happen when darkness is allowed to reign unchecked? Stay with me as we uncover the horrifying events that follow. As the night deepens, what should have been a moment of rest turns into a scene of unimaginable horror. This biblical story doesn't spare us from the brutal reality of what happened in Gibeon. Wicked men surrounded the house, demanding the elderly man hand over the Levite for their vile intentions. It's a moment that chills to the bone, a group driven by depravity, completely devoid of humanity. How does a community fall to such depths? The Bible forces us to confront these unsettling truths, making us ask what happens when evil is left unchecked. In a desperate attempt to protect his guest, the elderly man offers his own daughter and the Levite's concubine instead. The weight of this decision is almost unbearable to consider, and yet it's recorded here without embellishment. This biblical story challenges us to grapple with the complexities of human nature. It's not about endorsing these actions, but about holding up a mirror to the devastating effects of a world disconnected from God. When we make choices based on fear or self-preservation, we can end up complicit in greater evils. The concubine, handed over to the mob, suffers unspeakable violence throughout the night. This act of cruelty leaves an indelible scar, not only on her life, but on the moral fabric of the nation. This biblical story forces us to sit with the discomfort, not as spectators, but as participants in a broader conversation about sin and justice. How many times do we see injustice in our own world and remain silent? The Bible is asking, what will you do when faced with evil? It's easy to question the decisions made that night, but how often do we, too, justify compromises under pressure? Perhaps not as extreme, but every small compromise chips away at our integrity. This biblical story is a warning against rationalizing sin, no matter how desperate the circumstances. Think about moments in your own life when you felt trapped. Did you lean into God's wisdom, or did fear dictate your choices? The answer reveals where your foundation truly lies. What makes this part of the story so haunting is its silence. The Bible doesn't detail the emotions, the cries, or the aftermath in vivid descriptions. Instead, it leaves room for reflection, forcing us to imagine the unimaginable. This biblical story pulls no punches, reminding us that sin's consequences ripple far beyond the initial act. The horror of that night wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a collective failure of an entire community. The next morning, the Levite finds his concubine at the door, her life cruelly extinguished. It's a scene that stops you in your tracks, one that lingers in your mind long after you've read it. This biblical story isn't here to comfort, it's here to convict. It asks us to confront the ways we've allowed selfishness, apathy, or fear to guide our actions. How many lives around us remain untouched by God's love because we chose comfort over courage? In our world, news of violence and injustice feels almost routine. We scroll past headlines, shake our heads, and move on. This biblical story refuses to let us do that. It demands our attention, our outrage, and our resolve to stand against the darkness. Have you ever thought about what role you play in your community? Are you a light in the darkness, or do you, like the people of Gibeon, turn away when it matters most? The horror of this act leaves no one untouched, not the Levite, not the elderly man, not the people of Gibeon. It's a stark reminder that sin never exists in isolation. It grows, infects, and destroys everything it touches. This biblical story is a call to vigilance, to guard our hearts and communities against the creeping influence of evil. It's not enough to avoid doing wrong, we must actively pursue what is right. As the Levite takes the next steps, the story shifts from personal tragedy to national reckoning. The horrors of Gibeon will not remain hidden. This biblical story takes us deeper into the consequences of ignoring God's law and the weight of collective responsibility. Stay with me as we uncover how this tragedy sparks a firestorm across all of Israel. The morning after the tragedy, the Levite made a decision that would shake an entire nation. This biblical story takes an unimaginable turn as he takes the body of his concubine and divides it into 12 parts. Each piece is sent to the tribes of Israel, a gruesome call to attention that no one could ignore. Can you imagine receiving such a message? The shock, the outrage, it's a moment that jolts everyone out of complacency. But why such an extreme act? The Bible often uses the unthinkable to demand reflection and action. The Levites' action wasn't just a cry for justice, it was a desperate attempt to make the nation confront its moral decay. This biblical story reveals the power of communication, even in its most disturbing forms. Think about how we respond to injustice today. Social media posts, protests, petitions, they're modern equivalents of sending a powerful, undeniable message. The Levite knew that words alone wouldn't suffice. He needed to shake the tribes to their core. Imagine the reaction as the pieces arrived. Leaders, families, entire communities gathering to discuss what had happened. This biblical story forces us to confront the weight of collective responsibility. How often do we see evil and assume it's someone else's problem? The Levites' shocking message left no room for indifference. It demanded a response, reminding us that ignoring sin only allows it to fester and grow. It's easy to criticize the Levite for his actions, but think about the urgency of his message. This biblical story shows us that sometimes drastic measures are necessary to wake people up. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you needed to deliver a hard truth, even if it was uncomfortable? The Bible challenges us to speak out against injustice, even when it costs us our comfort or reputation. The tribal leaders couldn't turn a blind eye to what had happened. The Levites' gruesome message made sure of that. This biblical story serves as a reminder that accountability isn't just about pointing fingers. It's about taking ownership of the role we play in allowing evil to persist. When was the last time you examined your own heart or your community's culture? The Bible calls us to be vigilant, to stand as guardians of righteousness. What's striking is how the Levites' act unites the tribes, even if briefly. This biblical story emphasizes the power of a shared moral outrage to bring people together. It's a reminder that while evil divides, the pursuit of justice has the potential to unite. Think about movements in history, moments when people came together to confront injustice, whether it's ending slavery or fighting for civil rights. These moments show the transformative power of standing against evil. But this story isn't about easy solutions. The Levites' shocking message opens the door to a response, but it doesn't dictate what that response should be. This biblical story challenges us to think critically about how we address sin and injustice. Do we react impulsively, or do we seek God's wisdom in finding the right course of action? The difference can mean the rise or fall of a nation or a community. As the tribes prepare to meet and discuss what has happened, there's a sense of unease. This biblical story leaves us questioning not just the actions of the Levite, but the state of the nation as a whole. How did they let things get this bad? It's a reminder that complacency and compromise don't lead to peace. They lead to destruction. The Bible pushes us to stay alert, to guard against the slow drift away from God's truth. What happens next is both inevitable and devastating. The outrage sparked by the Levites' message leads to a civil war that will leave the nation scarred for generations. This biblical story forces us to consider the cost of justice and the consequences of unchecked sin. Stay with me as we delve into the conflict that will shape Israel's history forever. Outrage spread like wildfire across Israel after receiving the Levites' shocking message. This biblical story transitions from personal tragedy to national crisis as the tribes gather to confront the atrocity. The question on everyone's lips is, how could this happen among us? The assembly is unanimous in their condemnation of the crime, and their focus turns to the tribe of Benjamin, whose city of Gibeon harbored the guilty men. But what begins as a demand for justice spirals into one of the most devastating conflicts in Israel's history. When the tribes demand that Benjamin hand over the guilty men, they refuse, choosing instead to defend their own. This biblical story reveals the destructive power of pride and misplaced loyalty. Have you ever been in a situation where defending the wrong thing felt easier than admitting fault? Benjamin's decision to protect their own at all costs set the stage for a catastrophic war. It's a sobering reminder of how quickly stubbornness can turn into self-destruction. The first battles are brutal, with Benjamin proving to be a formidable opponent. This biblical story describes how the small tribe, despite being outnumbered, inflicts heavy losses on the other tribes. It's a scene that feels almost paradoxical. How could those defending such evil appear victorious? But isn't that the nature of sin? It often seems powerful in the short term, but its foundation is always weak. The Bible teaches us that while evil may triumph temporarily, it cannot stand against God's ultimate justice. As the war drags on, the cost becomes staggering. Thousands of lives are lost on both sides, and the nation is plunged into chaos. This biblical story forces us to confront the collateral damage of unresolved sin. How many conflicts in our own lives escalate because we fail to address the root cause? The tribes of Israel acted in righteous anger, but their actions also reveal the dangers of reacting without seeking God's guidance. Justice pursued without wisdom can lead to devastation. After suffering significant losses, the tribes finally seek God's direction. This biblical story shifts as they fast, weep, and offer sacrifices, pleading for divine intervention. It's a poignant reminder that true victory comes not through our strength, but through reliance on God. How often do we charge ahead, relying on our own plans, only to find ourselves defeated? The Bible calls us to pause, reflect, and seek God's will before taking action. The final battle sees the tide turn against Benjamin. This biblical story details how the combined forces of Israel, under God's guidance, overcome the tribe. The once proud defenders of Gibeon are left decimated, their cities burned, and their people scattered. It's a moment of reckoning, but also one of profound sorrow. The Bible doesn't celebrate the destruction, it mourns it, showing us the devastating consequences of unchecked sin and division. Even when justice is served, the scars remain. What stands out in this narrative is the delicate balance between justice and mercy. This biblical story highlights how easily justice can slip into vengeance when guided by human hands alone. Have you ever experienced a moment when your desire for justice turned into something darker? The tribes of Israel remind us of the importance of seeking God's wisdom to temper our actions, ensuring that our pursuit of righteousness doesn't leave behind unnecessary destruction. By the end of the conflict, the tribe of Benjamin is nearly wiped out, a sobering testament to how pride and sin can lead to a community's downfall. This biblical story leaves us questioning how such a tragedy could have been avoided. Could humility, repentance, or timely action have changed the course of events? The Bible challenges us to reflect on our own lives and the ways we can prevent small conflicts from escalating into disasters. The war's aftermath leaves a gaping wound in the nation, one that cannot be ignored. This biblical story sets the stage for a desperate attempt to restore what was lost, to rebuild a tribe from the ashes. But how do you find hope and unity in the midst of devastation? Join me as we explore the surprising turn of events that brings restoration to Benjamin and lessons of grace for us all. After the devastation of the civil war, the nation of Israel is left in mourning. This biblical story shifts from tragedy to a glimmer of hope as the tribes recognize the gravity of their actions. Nearly wiping out an entire tribe wasn't just a loss for Benjamin, it was a wound on the collective body of Israel. Imagine standing in the aftermath of such destruction, grappling with the weight of your choices. The Bible shows us that even in moments of despair, God's grace has the power to bring restoration. The remaining tribes gather, realizing that the extinction of Benjamin would leave a permanent scar on their unity. This biblical story highlights an important lesson. Even when mistakes have been made, it's never too late to seek reconciliation. How often do we let pride or fear stop us from mending broken relationships? The Israelites demonstrate the power of humility as they come together to find a way to rebuild what was lost. Their actions remind us that healing begins with a willingness to acknowledge the damage done. To preserve the tribe of Benjamin, the Israelites devise a plan to provide wives for the survivors. This biblical story paints a picture of creativity born out of desperation. While the methods may seem unconventional, the heart behind their actions is clear. They are determined to preserve the tribe at all costs. Isn't that what hope often looks like? It's not always neat or perfect, but it finds a way forward. In our own lives, how often do we give up when things don't go as planned instead of seeking new solutions? What's striking is how the Israelites' actions, though imperfect, reflect God's mercy. This biblical story reminds us that God doesn't wait for us to have it all figured out before offering grace. He meets us in our brokenness and works through our flawed efforts to bring about restoration. Have you ever felt like you've made too many mistakes to make things right? The Bible shows us that as long as there's a willingness to turn back to God, there's always hope for renewal. The rebuilding of Benjamin isn't just about preserving a tribe, it's about healing a nation. This biblical story serves as a reminder that restoration is a communal effort. The Israelites didn't leave the Benjamites to fend for themselves. They stepped in to help them rebuild. Think about your own community. Are there relationships or opportunities that need restoration? Sometimes, being the hands and feet of God means stepping into someone else's brokenness and helping them find a way forward. This story also teaches us about the importance of second chances. Benjamin had fallen to the brink of destruction because of their sin, yet God's grace allowed them a path to rebuild. This biblical story echoes throughout the Bible, where redemption is a constant theme. From David's failures to Peter's denial, God shows that no mistake is too great to overcome. How often do we write ourselves or others off when things go wrong? The Bible invites us to see beyond failure and embrace the possibility of renewal. As Benjamin begins to recover, the nation learns a deeper lesson about unity. This biblical story underscores that no part of the body can be discarded without affecting the whole. The tribes of Israel realized that their strength lay in their collective identity, not in their divisions. Isn't that a lesson for us today? Whether in families, churches, or communities, unity isn't just an ideal, it's a necessity. What steps can you take to build unity in the places where you've been planted? Hope shines brightest in the darkest moments, and this biblical story is a testament to that truth. The restoration of Benjamin wasn't immediate or easy, but it was a powerful reminder that God's mercy triumphs over judgment. How many times have you felt like your situation was beyond repair, only to find that God was quietly working behind the scenes? The Bible encourages us to trust in His timing, knowing that even the most broken pieces can be made whole again. As we reflect on this journey, from tragedy to restoration, this biblical story leaves us with a profound truth. No matter how far we've fallen, God's grace is always within reach. But what does this mean for our own lives? How do we take these lessons and apply them to the challenges we face? Stay with me as we dive deeper into the practical ways this story speaks to us today. After walking through this shocking and unforgettable biblical narrative, let me ask you, what lessons will you take away? This biblical story isn't just a tale of tragedy and justice, it's a wake-up call for all of us. How often do we ignore the signs of compromise in our own lives or in our communities? What steps can you take today to stand for truth, seek justice, and show God's love, even in a world that feels distant from Him? Now, let's take it a step further. How will you ensure your faith remains strong in the face of darkness? How will you let this story inspire real change in your life? Reflect on these questions, share your thoughts, and don't forget to take action. If you've found value in this journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you won't miss future insights into powerful stories like this one. Let's keep learning, growing, and applying God's truth together.